Let's talk about the Roman Empire. And I'm not jumping onto any trend in which I tell you, oh, what is the one thing I think about at least once in a day and that kind of Roman Empire, but I'm talking about the actual Roman Empire. This book that I read, it's called Scorpius by Monty Ryan, and it is about Roman Empire, but specifically about the chariot races that used to take place during the Roman Empire. It talks not just about, from a historically fiction perspective, the races and the people involved in it, but also the politics that went behind those races and the stakes that were involved. This story takes you on a journey of one slave boy who tries to free himself, and the only path that he sees to freedom is through participating in these deadly and brutal chariot races. So the name of the protagonist, if you haven't guessed it already, is the same name as the book. It's Scorpius. It's written by Monty Ryan, and Monty really delves deep into like the historical facts by weaving a story around the Roman Empire and basically the politics that were involved during that time, but it tells it through the lens and through the eyes of Scorpius. Scorpius, who grows up as an orphan boy, and he is basically a slave during that time. And during his childhood and during those initial formative years, people start noticing that he's really good with horses. There's one chapter in which there's a horse that breaks free, and Scorpius somehow gets it under control, and that like gets people talking. Is this a person who has some potential to participate in these chariot races and win? But yeah, it was a very brutal journey, because the races themselves, like, it's 4 horses tied to a chariot, and then the chariot has to like move across really fast, but it can be like really violent, because there are people who are obviously trying to outpace you. There are people who are trying to like make sure that you lose, and they do it in any possible manner, so you can end up losing your life. But most of the times why people do it is glory and fame. I mean, the usual, especially during that time, which is the time of the kings and the time of the emperors. During that time, I mean, all you had was like glory and fame and power, and the simplest way to get it, especially for a person with no resources, was to participate in these chariot races. So we see the journey of Scorpius from a slave to when he starts participating in these races, and the author describes in detail what those races are about, not just like in the moment, but also like what goes on behind the scene, the politics that are at play, what kind of dynamics, other characters who like are friends or enemies, or can be enemies who are just pretending to be friends, and how they try to meddle in your affairs or mess with your races and try to make sure that you either succeed or you like lose based on their own personal interests. So there was that dynamics to it, but also like when the stakes are so high and everybody wants glory and fame through these races, then of course nobody's going to like that a slave boy is doing good. So there are multiple descriptions of the chariot races that happens, and I especially like the bond between Scorpius and his horse, because I feel like when you're in this kind of sports, I'll call it sports, you really have to rely upon the person or like the animal that's responsible for like not just your life but also making you succeed. So that kind of bond that existed was really interesting to read about, and the author really goes into detail. So since this is a historical fiction plus like sporty vibes, the author talks about like includes a lot of historical facts into the story, and it looked like the book was really well researched, but also like the chariot races themselves, the way they were supposed to happen, what happened before and after the chariot races, that felt like it was very authentic, and reading about it did not feel boring. With sports fiction, it can sometimes be a hit or miss. I'm like categorizing it as sports fiction. It's more like historical fiction, but with the sports element to it. But yeah, it can be really a hit or miss, because when you're describing the sport, sometimes people who really are not interested can get bored reading it. But the author tried to make sure that like as engaging as the races themselves were, it like came off on paper. So people who were reading about it, like readers, actually felt that adrenaline rush when somebody won or lost, or when there was that peaking moment in the story, in the race, when you didn't know who was going to win or who was going to lose. One thing about books like this that is the make or break factor for me is whether or not I can find myself rooting for the character, and that really has to do with, you know, adding the humane angles and adding the personality and adding that those behavioral characteristics of the characters that you can relate to. And I think the author did that very well, not just for Scorpius but for other characters as well, that you can really, you know, comprehend like what went behind creating this person and like putting them in this place right now. You could really relate to that person, and once you add that humane angle to it and add their life story and have an understanding of what they've gone through, that makes the stake much higher and that makes you more involved. Otherwise, like, a race is just a race. If you don't know any of the characters, if you don't like really root for or want somebody to lose really badly, if you have like no strong feelings for anybody, then it doesn't matter what you're reading about, then it doesn't matter who wins or loses the race, right? You're like, oh, it's the protagonist is obviously going to win, or oh, of course, for the character arc it's important that it's obviously that he's going to lose. But when you actually care about the character, that's when it gets more interesting, because you're like, no, he has to win. Oh no, he's losing, what's gonna happen now? So that element of actually making a reader involved in that journey of the character is something that I feel like the author did really well, and that speaks to the writing of this book. Like, the writing and the storytelling was so descriptive but also engaging and captivating that it made the reader engaged in whatever the story was trying to convey. When I was reading this book, I really felt like it was like Hunger Games, but only set in the Roman Empire. Like, the behind the scene politics of people who were like organizing these races, and also like the lives of people at stake, but them feeling like this is the only chance they had to freedom to survive. It all felt like very like Hunger Games, but set in a historical instead of a dystopian world. And when I was reading it, one of the things that really like intrigued me was, as Scorpius was getting some fame and like succeeding as a successful like racer, there were so many moments in which like he himself felt like, oh, is my life truly changing? Like, with that moment of disbelief, but it's like, what is happening? Then he makes it to the city of Rome, and there he has to deal with like different stuff altogether. Like, if you're into sports, if you're say a cricketer or a football player, you realize, right, when you're in the game, when you're playing the game, that's completely different stakes altogether. Some people who are really good at the game that they're playing feel like, oh, this is something I'm good at, this is all that matters. But in reality, in real life as well, it's much more than that. You have to deal with coaches, you have to deal with other team players, you have to deal with the organizers, you have to deal with the real life out there, you have to deal with the people who are cheering for you, who are rooting for you have to deal with people who do not want you to win, right? There's that external element to it, and that reflected well even in this story, especially like when Scorpius started winning. That external element could be like so complex, and those dynamics were so intriguing to read about. At some point in the book, there was a riot and like literal bloodshed and brutality that you could witness. Oh, this kind of stuff really happened because people were like so involved in something. And it just felt so realistic. Like, you could taste the blood and you could taste the adrenaline rush that people were going through as they were participating in those races. I would really recommend this book to all the people who are into Roman empires, into historical fiction, into sports fiction, or generally want to read about stuff that is really fast-paced, engaging, and adventurous, and something that, you know, leaves an impression behind even after you're done reading the book. So this was one of those books for me. I'll leave a link to buy the book in the description below, and you can go check it out.